In this video, we're going to look at the LAMBDA function in Microsoft Excel. Now, this function is only available to Microsoft Office Excel 365 subscribers. So what this function does is it allows you to create your own custom functions that have your own named parameters and your own custom calculations. So just to give you a preview of what we're going to create today, I have a data set of loan records, and in this first preview I just want to show you a custom function I made that calculates the weighted average interest rate off of this entire data set. So I can start typing. There is my first custom function called weighted average. It has only two inputs, the weight range, which is the loan amount range, and then the range of the thing I want to get the weighted average for, which is the interest rate range. And there is the weighted average. I have a second custom function I created that is a little more involved. It's a weighted average based on a criteria. So this time we want to get the weighted average on just the auto loans. So I have another custom function called weighted average with criteria, and it has only four inputs. We have first our criteria range, which is going to be the loan type. We have our criteria, which is going to be this cell here, auto loans. And then we have our sum range or our weight range, which is going to be the loan amount column, and then we have the rate range, and there is the weighted average based on a criteria. So we're going to begin by creating a custom function that will perform the weighted average rate calculation on this entire data set. So we're going to input it as if we were just doing it our normal way, which for me that is using the sum product function. So the first input is our weight range, which is the loan amount range, and then we have our interest rate range, which is the thing we want to get the weighted average for. To get the weighted average rate, we're going to divide that by the sum of our weight, which is also our loan amount range. So the sum product function multiplies all the values in these two parallel columns by each other, sums up the total of all of those products, and then we divide by the weight to get the weighted average. So now what we want to do is nest our calculation inside the LAMBDA function, and this has two types of inputs, parameters and the calculation itself. The calculation has to be on the end, so we have that already. Really, we made our calculation here, so we have that part. So in front of it we're going to define some parameters, and this can really be any sort of text or acronym you want, so long as it's not a function name that already exists. So our first parameter is going to be our sum range or our weighted range, which is also our sum range, but we only need to input it once when we define it. So we have our weighted range, and then our second input is our rate range, so I'll just call this R range. And what we need to do over here in our calculation is actually plug in our parameters where these ranges are. So that's what we'll do. We have our rate range parameter. So that is everything we need there. So I'm going to add a closing parentheses, and now this won't actually produce an output. What we're going to do eventually is plug this formula into the name manager, give it a name, and then at that point we'll have our custom function. But before we do that, we need to test it. So the way you test this to make sure it works is you can add a set of parentheses after this closing one here and plug range references in as if they were the parameters here. So we have our weight range and then we have our rate range, and that produces the same result, so we know it's working. So now what I'm going to do is copy just this piece of the formula. We're going to go up to formulas and then name manager. You can also get to the name manager by clicking Control F3. In this window we're going to hit new, and we'll call this, we'll just give it an acronym for weighted average. That will be our function name, and then down here in this last slot we're gonna put our lambda formula in here. So I'm gonna click OK and then close this out. I'll delete this out and then start typing our weighted average. You can see it pops up just like any other function, and now I have just those two inputs that I defined. So we have our weight range and then our interest rate range, and we get exactly the same thing. So in this next example, we want to create a custom function that calculates the weighted average interest rate based on a criteria. Our criteria is going to be either auto loans or business loans. So we're going to begin again with the sum product function. Now this time we have a criteria range, and our criteria range needs to start first and it needs to be enclosed in a set of parentheses. So our criteria range is the loan type, and we want anything in that loan type column that is equal to the value in this cell here, auto loans. So what this creates is a series or an array of true-false values. If there is a match and the value is auto, in this range we get a true. If there's not a match, we get a false. So in order to make this work within the sum product function, what we need to do is multiply these true-false values by 1. That forces the true falses into their numerical equivalence, which is 1 for true. So there's a value of 1 every time there's a true. There's a value of 0 every time there's a false. And then once we have those as numbers, they get multiplied by the parallel corresponding values in the next two columns. So anytime there's a match, it's 1 times the loan amount times the rate. If there's not a match, it's 0 times the loan amount times the rate, which results in 0. So now we have our criteria range set up. We just want to get our weighted range, which is our loan amount column, and then our interest rate range. So that will get us the sum product based on that criteria, and now we need to divide it by the sum of just our criteria. So we're going to use the SUMIF function. So our criteria range again is column C, our criteria is auto loans, and then our sum range is column D. So that gets us our weighted average rate for just auto loans, and now we want to insert this in the lambda function. So our first parameter is going to be our criteria range, so I'll just call this C range. We then have our criteria cell, so I'll call that C cell, and then we have our weight range, so I'll call this WRNG, and then we have our interest rate range, so I'll call this RRNG. And then we have our calculation, so we need to plug in our values here into our calculation. So our criteria range is there, and here also we have our criteria cell parameter, which is G10. We have our weight range. And then we have our interest rate range. So that is everything we need there. And now we can test this again by plugging in our ranges and cell in this last set of parentheses as if they were the parameters like they look here. So we have our criteria range and then our criteria cell value. We have our weight range, which is the loan amount column, and then our interest rate range. So we get exactly the same thing, so we know this works. So now all we need to do is just copy this portion of the formula. I'm going to go up to Name Manager. I'm going to add a new function. We'll call this weighted average with criteria. And then paste in our formula down here, click OK. So there it is. We can plug in our values to our parameters. And there it is. And I can drag this down and we get the weighted average for business loans. Well, that is all for now. Thanks for watching. Please remember to subscribe.